Hello, we're Creation Fellowship Santee. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight we're going to have Steve Hendrickson. He's one of our regulars, even a volunteer. He's going to speak on engineering answers to old Earth creation questions. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Steve. Go
Okay,
ahead.
start sharing right now.
Yes. Green button at the bottom.
Okay,
Looks good. We
should
see
be
it.
coming up.
We see it.
There we go. Is that right? And I don't know if I can shut this other thing off, but I probably need to.
What is that?
It's on the side here. There we go. Okay. So, I am going to talk about engineering answers to old Earth creation arguments. I had to deal with some of these, first of all, when I first became a Christian. So when I became a Christian, I was teaching electrical engineering at the Air Force Institute of Technology in Dayton, Ohio, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So it's a different Dayton than Dayton, Tennessee, which was involved in the Scopes trial. And I'll briefly talk about that. But I've got quite a few slides to get through, and I have a goal to get past the Scopes trial by, it was originally 10 o'clock. I may not make it quite that early, but let's go ahead and look at this. First of all, we have the Bible. We should read it and we should study it, not let it get dusty. And something not found in the Bible is your opinion. So just understand that. And what are engineers? Well, we're really applied scientists. What we do is we see a problem that's out there. We try to figure out a solution to fix the problem. It often involves designing and testing. So that's pretty much what we do. So the introduction is going to be a two-parter because I'm covering quite a bit of stuff. I wanted to talk a little bit about the 22 to 24 May homeschooling convention I attended within Jason Lyle's Biblical Science Institute. Yes, that was a fun thing that I did. Then also, probably the most favorite question that's ever asked is what about all the suffering and death in the world? That's probably the most famous question we get. And the young earth creationist answer is biblical. It's been going on for about 6,000 years on how to answer that question. However, the old earth creationist answer has really been formulated very recently, around 1850, actually 1859, when you think about Darwin writing his Origin on the Origin of the Species. So I'll talk about that as well. Um, Old Earth creationists include modern science and engineering, which is physics, astronomy, geology, with the assumption of millions and billions of years based on what they look forward to, and they have to have it for evolutionary reasons, but they also develop their own pieces of evidence. But is it really necessary? And that'll be discussed pretty well. Also, does science ever prove things? Nope, and I'm going to show you why. High science. Well, theory of evolution is definitely considered high science and is really the only way of origins that you can teach nowadays. So that's interesting too. Then there was this idea of a Scopes monkey trial in Dayton, Tennessee. And what happened afterwards was a play written called Inherit the Wind, and it really opened the door to evolution. And now evolution is the only science that can be taught in our public schools. And that's not exactly the way it was originally formulated. So we'll talk about that. Now, I was an astrophysics major back in 1973 and 74 at the University of Oregon under Edwin Ebbinghausen, who was the most famous astrophysicist in the Northwest at the time. And so I was interested in astronomy, but later on, due to circumstances, I ended up going into electrical engineering. And I had a lot of problems with a young Earth argument based on what I learned at the University of Oregon and through my hobby of astronomy. So that was a big problem for me, but after I became a believer, I just had to work through the problem, and I was never quite satisfied with everything that was said. So I did develop my own way of handling it, and I now know that Dr. Andy McIntosh and Dr. Anthony Silvestro, they both use the same argument now after having explained it to them. So it's a pretty good argument. And also it can be applied to geology and nuclear engineering as well when you're talking about radiometric dating methods. So I can use it there as well. Also, I wanted to say that we have this guy named Richard Dawkins. Everybody has heard of him. Anyway, he really says that he detests young Earth creationists because they're not like old Earth creationists who are respectable theologians. And we're going to cover exactly what he says about that. And an all-important question, was Jesus Christ a young Earth creationist? So we're going to cover that. And the answer is going to turn out to be yes, but we're going to cover it. So anyway, I've known Jason Lyle for quite a while. He stayed at my house back in 2019. And he met my dog, who was a puppy at that time. She was very fond of him. We had a good time. I took him to the airport that day, and I've got to know him better over the years. And he's got a lady, Denise Toth, who is the BSI coordinator. She's kind of like an Energizer bunny from what I've seen, but she helped out with this homeschool convention back in May, and it was a lot of fun. And I got there, and there's Leilani. She's on this call, and Dan Letha was there, and myself. And so we had a good time doing that. There's Jason using one of Dan's cartoons. He ended up speaking 6 times at that, and that's almost unheard of. In 2 days to speak 3 times a day, that was quite a bit, but he's very popular. Okay. And we had a lot of questions and answers, and it was interesting because so many of the questions I had, I'm surprised so many people don't know this. These are common questions that you can answer and talk to people about. So it was very good. But anyway, here's Jason. He only came down one time to actually sign things, and that was on Saturday. And after I think it was his last talk that he gave, he came down and did that. But anyway, we had a lot of questions, a lot of activity, and sold a lot of books in there and had a good time. Here's some of the things Jason says. In a sense, Genesis is the most foundational book of the Bible since it records the first events that transpired in history. Only the biblical worldview can make sense of science. Now, there's a lot of very well-known evangelicals that are out there who are old Earth and young Earth. For example, Hugh Ross, William Lane Craig, John X, Stephen Meyer, William Dembski, Norman Geisler, Wayne Grudem, Gary Habermas, Frank Turek, Sean McDowell, Lee Strobel. Those are old Earth creationist people. John MacArthur, R.C. Sproul, R. Albert Mohler, James White, Andy McIntosh, Stuart Burgess, Kurt Wise, Nathaniel Jansen, Jason Lyle, Danny Faulkner, Jonathan Sarfati, Robert Carter. Many of these people I know. I didn't know MacArthur. Have never met MacArthur, and I've met Sproul, and I've met Mohler, and I've met White, and pretty much the rest of the people I have met as well, with the exception of Daniel Jensen. But anyway, those people are young Earth creationists. They're well qualified in their fields. So we go back to John chapter 3, where Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and he says, "If I told you earthly things and you believe not, how shall ye believe if I tell you of heavenly things?" Well, the universe is definitely heavenly. We can test earthly things, right? 1 Thessalonians 5:21 in the Amplified Bible says, "But test all things carefully, so you can recognize what is good. Hold firmly to that which is good." Perhaps we should check our assumptions. By the way, you'll notice I'm talking pretty fast because I do have quite a few slides to get through. And some slides I'm not going to really cover very much. They're kind of busy, but they're going to be on the video and they're going to be taped. So if you want to pause over them later, you're welcome to do that. But I do have quite a few slides to get through. Okay, next. The Bible tells us the world hates us and there is nothing new under the sun. For example, after Judas left at the Last Supper, Jesus says to his 11 disciples there, he said, "If the world hate you, ye know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love its own. But because ye are not of the world, but I have chosen you out of the world, therefore the world hateth you." Also, Solomon wrote, "There is no new thing under the sun," in Ecclesiastes 1:9. The world seems to like the OECs, oddly enough, who agree with the millions and billions of years based on that view that seems to be, in my mind, really something new under the sun. That's not something that has been discussed for a long time. So I do take those verses and I've looked at the context of them, and I think they're useful for this discussion. So, problem of death and suffering. Well, the Eck answer is very straightforward. Man's, from Genesis, it's been around for about 6,000 years. It's man's fault via sin, the sin that he did back in the Garden of Eden. That's the original sin that's back there, and the fall of man came at that time. However, the old earth creationist answer is quite new. And so when I hear an old earth creationist speaking, I will oftentimes go up to them and ask, what about death and suffering? And they will give me an explanation, which doesn't sound very good to me. And then I will ask, was anybody using this explanation before 1850? That's how I ask the question. And that sort of sets them back a little on their heels, because the simple answer to that question is no. Nobody was using your question or answering the question this way for pretty much church history. So therefore, I think it's an issue. Also, millions of years of death and suffering for animals only, and man came later and then sinned. Well, we have all of this death and suffering and carnivory. We have all this stuff going on. That doesn't seem quite right. So it seems like the OEC answer is something new under the sun. So I went to, I did copy a few things from some YouTube videos, and this one's by Brian Osborne of Answers in Genesis. He's a good presenter. It's only about 6 minutes, 5:59, and he goes through it very nicely. So I'd like to recommend it to you. It's called All Christians Need to Hear This Message About Death. And he talks about Genesis 2, 16 and 17. But if you eat of that tree, you will die. Also, he talks about what caused death. Well, man's sin in the garden is what caused death, and then suffering, and the whole world was impacted. So we know from Romans 8:22 that sin impacted the whole world at that time. So it's well shown. And in Genesis 3:18, by the way, if you watch this video, you'll get a lot more of this involved, more verses than this. But anyway, thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. Okay, so we have thorns and thistles being produced after the fall of man. And with the old earth view, we have those things before man even came on the scene. We have death and thorns and disease and cancer and bloodshed and carnivory for millions of years before man even came onto the scene when you talk about an old earth creation view. That's a problem. Oh, Adam, this is such a perfect world. Yes, Eve, it's very good, just like God said, but it's built upon this pile of fossils and pain and death and killing. So he makes some very good points here, I think. Also, if death is before sin, then death is not the consequent or payment for sin. Then Jesus' death does not pay our sin debt. We see an inconsistency here in the argument, and I think they're very correct to be able to see that. Now, one more. Another video here. This one's by Dr. Terry Mortensen, who does a wonderful job presenting this. It's about 11:48 is what this video is, called The Doctrine of Death by Dr. Terry Mortensen. He talks about what we had. We had a perfect world, and then there was this intrusion at the fall of man, where we had death, disease, extinction, earthquakes, tornadoes, etc. That's the fall. It's a fallen world, a cursed creation. And we have a global flood that ended up creating the fossil record, at least for the vast amount. That would be true. Okay, next. It's going to be restored. That's a wonderful thing. We're going to have a new heaven and a new earth. But if you look at the old earth view of this, that record doesn't really make sense, because in the initial creation, we have a lot of death and suffering and stuff going on from the very beginning. And so what's it going to go to for a final result? And so I think he covers that well. It just doesn't seem to make a very good argument, and I believe he's right. All right, so Dr. Mortensen ends this up with the idea of two histories of death. So this idea, this God's word, no death initially, then we have death as a temporary part of history, followed by no death in the future. That's the view that was common from about 33 AD. This is the church age I'm talking about, not necessarily Judaism, which would go. But anyway, from about 33 AD to about 1860 is what you're going to see here. So uh, next, 1860 on, that's what you have when you get into an old Earth creation view. So anyway, this is what we see now being in most places out there. And it just doesn't seem to make sense, because if we have death before, are we going to have death after? And you have to take those into consideration. Okay, this guy right here, Dr. Charles, Professor Charles Bennett, very well famous man, John Hopkins University and that sort of thing. Anyway, here's what he had to say. I don't know if he's a Christian or not, but what he gives right here is very good. So this was from Science Magazine, and the science title misstep, Science Magazine in 2011. And here's what he said, because we need to understand that the word prove is used in science quite a bit, but it shouldn't be. So he's a professor of physics and astronomy at Johns Hopkins University and a principal investigator for NASA. He wrote the following letter to the editors of Science. The title of the 6 May News of the Week story, at long last, Gravity Probe B satellite proves Einstein right. Page 649, made me cringe. I find myself frequently repeating to students and the public that science doesn't prove theories. Scientific measurements can only disprove theories or be consistent with them. Any theory that is consistent with measurements could be disproved by a future measurement. I wouldn't have expected Science Magazine, of all places, to say a theory was proved. The editors responded, Bennett is completely correct. It's an important conceptual point, and we blew it. Well, that's good, because I have to teach that to a lot of people too. Okay, there's also, I thought I'd throw a joke in here. There is no trick to being a humorist when you have the whole government working for you. Well, we've got the government out there telling us we can only teach one view of origins right now. And our new God apparently must be Charles Darwin. We have to bow down to that and to the millions and billions of years paradigm. On the origin of the species, let's look at the whole title to Darwin's book. It was On the Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. It actually has quite a bit of racist language in it when you read it. And here's the quote. A fair result can be obtained only by fully stating and balancing the facts and arguments on both sides of each question. That was a statement by Charles Darwin. Where was that? Well, that quote appears in the introduction to his book on the origin of the species. Specifically, it is found in the context where Darwin discusses his approach to presenting his theory of evolution, emphasizing the importance of considering all evidence impartially. The exact phrasing may be very slightly, or may vary slightly depending on the edition, but this is the commonly cited version from the first edition. This good advice from Darwin himself shows how biased science is today. Right, and we do have biased science, but we also have the fruits of some of the Darwinian thought, including um, communism, the Holocaust, 100 million dead. You had eugenics, where we want a master race and that sort of thing. That's not good. That's not good fruit. There's a guy named Franz Hessing on Facebook. He does some very nice artificial intelligent memes and stuff. And he said, he talks about Darwin here. He says, far from being a definitive work, The Origin of the Species is saturated with conjecture. In the final 1876 printing of the 1972 edition, Darwin employed the word may 642 times, if 493 times, might 203 times, probable or probably 182, tendency 153, supposed 141, perhaps 63, no doubt 58, I believe 58 times, and I think 43 times. These are what are known as weasel words, and anybody who hears them knows that this is his thought and not necessarily the data controlling it. So that's an important point, I think. Also, Darwin Day. That's celebrated every year on the 12th of February. And so back in 24, I made this, I would call it an informational meme that I made up just to put on Facebook that day. Okay, here's an important thing. And this is how I frame it with people I'm talking to. And the important thing is things either happen naturally or not. We can agree that's true, correct? I've asked that question quite a few times. Things either happen naturally, which would be evolution, or not, which would mean some sort of intelligent design, maybe like Genesis in the Bible and that sort of thing. And we can usually agree that we can have two methods. So here's another Facebook post, very interesting. Astronomy and Physics, May 24th of this year. So just back in May, it says, whether you accept it or not, evolution is real, and it's been shaping life for billions of years. Evolution is proven science. It doesn't care what people believe. It happens anyway. Really, proven science. This is one of the primary options. It's evolution, right? However, it's not proven science since science does not prove things. It just had a direct, surprising mistake right there from a fairly official site. And the reason I bring that up is because when I was at Jason Lyle's homeschool conference and at his booth, I had a really nice couple come up to me and they said, you know, the difficulty I have is when I'm witnessing to family members and stuff, and they say things like, I'd believe in God if there was any good evidence for God. And I said, well, here's how I answer that question. I just asked them, have you looked in the mirror? Do you see your eyes? Do you see your skin? Explain about the complexities of the cell. In other words, you can sit there and explain to them, look, the cell is so complex in the eye and on the skin and that sort of thing that not a team of engineers or any master engineer in any way could possibly develop it. And you're looking at that every time you look in the mirror. So if you were to say that to God, if I believe in you, if there was only some evidence for you, he might very well look at you and say, you are without excuse. Because Romans 1:20 says, for since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. That's a pretty good answer here to the question. And that's an important witnessing tip. So I hope somebody else can use it. The lady said, I'm going to use that. And I said, absolutely use it. It's a good way to talk to these folks. All right, here's one of my favorites. Ask the beast. Let me check my time. Okay. Ask the beast and let them teach you, and the birds of this heaven and let them tell you, or speak to the earth and let it teach you, and let the fish of the sea declare to you, who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? One of my favorites. Okay, next. The devout Christian and father of the scientific method, Francis Bacon, said, man prefers to believe what he prefers to be true. That's a profound statement and a very good one. Frank Sherwin did a talk on the 12th of June, a very, very good talk on the scientific method. I had taught in my own apologetics class for about 5 weeks about the monkey trial. I did have some sharing back and forth with Frank, but I really enjoyed his talk. And I have a few slides that I just want to show you real quick. So the Scopes monkey trial did occur in July of 1925, basically from the 10th to the 25th of July. And it had to do with John Scopes, a young man who was teaching from teaching human evolution, which was against the Butler Act at that time. So I'm going to skip through this real quick. There's a lot written about it. It started on the 10th of July. There were some headlines. He was a 24-year-old substitute. And the interesting thing is that after he left teaching, he became a geologist and wrote later that he never taught the chapter on human evolution. That really wasn't the point of the trial. The point of the trial was to challenge this law. Okay, so textbook use was a civic biology presented in problems by Hunter. And so it taught about evolution, human descent. It taught about eugenics. It taught several other things. It was quite racist and really interesting. So the interesting thing I like about it is I have a good friend by the name of Robert Carter, who works for Creation Ministries International, and he did a review of that back in 2020. And it's a very interesting review and talks about many of the amazing things that are in that book, just how bad it is. Here's part of his conclusion here. He says, hunter-specific biology should never have been accepted by the citizens of Tennessee. And he talks about really it just had some bad stuff in it. So I'll let you look at the whole conclusion later because I need to get through this. Anyway, there was Clarence Darrow involved and William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was a pretty outspoken Christian at the time, and Clarence Darrow called himself an agnostic. Okay, so they were together. It was covered in newspapers worldwide and even some radio transmissions, which were kind of more new then. One of the great quotes is from the Dictionary of Christianity and Science, a book I have about 3 feet from me right now. It's on page 622. It says, it was in this context that Darrow uttered the famous declaration, it is bigotry for public schools to teach only one theory of origins. Well, when I went and I looked up the source of that quote, Grok AI came back and said, you know what? We don't find that as a primary source. As a matter of fact, they're saying that back here at the National Center of Science Education, I'm looking at the bottom of this. This is it to a 1974 creationist article suggesting misattribution. The dictionary's use likely stems from unverified secondary sources lacking primary evidence. So Grok was not impressed with this quote. And I would just say I've learned when I've dealt with science historians and things like that you need to use primary sources. You need a book that was written by Clarence Darrow, or you need a letter that he had, or you need a magazine or newspaper article that he had. That's a primary source. You certainly would not use some secondary source for it, and they're saying that this is misattributed. So I guess if you're going to use that source, it's a pretty good source. And if you're going to use that source, you probably should say that the original source is not quite known, but at least they are using it in the Dictionary of Christianity and Science. Okay. Also, I had met this guy named Philip Johnson a while back, but he wrote Darwin on Trial, pretty good guy. And there's me as a captain in the Air Force when I was teaching at Affett, and he has this book, Defeating Darwinism by Opening Minds by Philip Johnson. And he says in here, he's talking about Inherit the Wind, and that Inherit the Wind video came out in 1960, but was based on a play in 1955. And he says, Inherit the Wind is a masterpiece of propaganda. And he has some very good quotes. I'll let you see them in the video that's saved for this. Also, he talks about the real story of the Scopes trial is that the stereotype it promoted helped the Darwinists capture the power of the law, and they have since used the law to prevent other people from thinking independently. Now you must only teach one origin story. So it's a good point. Nancy Percy, who is not a young earth creationist, but she has some very good apologetics. She wrote this. She said, in fact, suppressing alternatives constitutes viewpoint discrimination, something the court has elsewhere pronounced unconstitutional. Those celebrating the anniversary of the Scopes trial, and she's talking about the 75th anniversary when she wrote this in 2000, this article, Scopes in the Reverse, she said those celebrating the anniversary of the Scopes trial ought to take a lesson from the Supreme Court and support the principle of openness in science education. How ironic that today it is the pro-evolution groups like PAW that are on the side of intolerance. The audience cheering the academic freedom won in 1925 ought to be calling for the same freedom in today's classroom. That's a very good point by Nancy Percy. Okay, also, the Scopes trial transcript is now cheap. I'll tell you, when I first started looking for that transcript, it was back in about 2000 was when I was looking for it. It was a book and it cost about $500. I said, I don't think so. I'm not going to buy it then. But I found out about 20 years ago I found out later that it had dropped to 50 and I still hadn't looked at it, but recently I found it on Amazon Kindle for $5. Well, for $5, it's worthwhile to have a searchable Scopes trial um, transcript. So there it is. And it's quite nice. So I did buy it and I did have it and I was able to search it. And the reason I wanted to search it was because of what Dr. David Menton, who was with Answers in Genesis, provided. He did a very nice video called Inherently Wind or Scopes Trial Fiction, which I have those. I use them in my class, and it's also on YouTube. And so the YouTube um, uh, site is right here for it. But it talked about the real smear the citizens of Dayton got from Inherent in the Wind and other things that came afterwards. However, in the transcript of the trial, Darrow on the citizens of Dayton, here's what he said. I think it's very interesting. I don't know as I was ever in a community in my life where my religious ideas differed as widely from the great mass I have found them since I have been in Tennessee. Yet here, a perfect stranger, and I can say what I have said before, that I have not found upon anybody's part, any citizen here in this town or outside, the slightest discourtesy. I have been treated better, kindlier, and more hospitably than I fancied would have been the case in the North. So that's very interesting. And this Inherit the Wind really was a very big smear against the conservative Christians in Dayton, Tennessee. All right. So anyway, there's some very good books. And as a matter of fact, I do like Greg Jarrett. Normally, he's on Fox News and stuff like that, but he really must be in love with um, Clarence Darrow. You must be in love with him because that's how his book was slanted. All right, and so there's some very good things out there. I've included them and shown them in my classes. You can get them; they're good, worthwhile. Okay. Also, the books that are out there, those are the dates for them. They have a lot of information on the Scopes trial as well. Grok provided a pretty nice summary of the Scopes trial. I went ahead and asked Grok as I was doing some studying for a summary of that, and it talked about them. Subsequent rulings like Epperson, Arkansas 68, Kitzmiller versus Dover 2005 ensured that only evolution as a scientifically supported theory is taught in public school science classes, with creationism or intelligent design excluded due to the First Amendment restrictions on religious instruction. The trial remains a pivotal moment in the ongoing debate over science, religion, and education. So that's the final. All right, now I'm done with that part. A little later than I like to be. However, now I'm going to talk about the science. And again, I told you back in the 60s, from about 65 on, I became very interested in astronomy, and I had a neighbor that had a telescope, and we got interested in the astronaut. I was glued to the TV on the 20th of July, 1969, when Neil Armstrong took his first step onto the moon. And then I went to the University of Oregon later in astrophysics. And so with all the documented distance to stars, this is one of the primary things that atheists as well as old Earth creationists will use. Is we have this distant starlight issue. And so we have these stars and galaxies millions and billions of light years away from the Earth. So the question assumes a constant speed of light at 186,000 miles per second or 300,000 kilometers per second over the age of the universe, which is at 13.8 billion years old. And so as I was looking at some of the young Earth creationist arguments for this, I was going, well, okay, I can see they're talking about things like appearance of age. They're talking about other things. I can see that, but these seems to be pretty good distance measurements that are being used. But there is a big assumption here, and here's the idea. And I'm going to get into that. I do have this book by Robert Jastrow. He was a well-known physicist and very well-known, and he wrote this book in 1980. And he says on the back, he says, scientists now have proven the universe we created in Universe was created in a fiery explosion 20 billion years ago. This is the new story of Genesis. It is the same story you read. Is it the same story you read in the Bible? And his famous quote was, "The scientist has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak," says Dr. Jastrow. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. Okay, it's a very famous quote, but he does talk about the bottom there, if you read it, the age of the universe was 15 to 20 billion years ago. Well, we now know that their age, they quote most of the time, is 13.8 billion years ago. All right. And when I was presented to this, I was not a believer yet. And he told me the Earth was this was a fellow faculty member at the Air Force Institute of Technology. I respected him very much. And he told me he thought the Earth was 6 to 10,000 years old. And I told him the Andromeda, I said, I know the Andromeda galaxy is more than 2 million light years away. And so I went home right after I talked to him and I showed him it's 2.54 now. Anyway, I started to think about what are the assumptions that are involved in that. And really, it has to do with the measurement of the data. If you're an engineer, data is important, very important. We look at data in tables and we look at data on graphs and charts. So who was the first person to accurately, I mean, closely accurately. I mean, there were other measurements, but the one who was pretty accurate was Leon Foucault, who was also known for Foucault pendulum, stuff like that. But anyway, Foucault's 1862 value was 298 million meters per second. Today's value that we recognize is 299 million, 792 and 458 meters per second. So it was very, very close. So it was a good measurement for C. So this was his measurement, his early measurement that was done. This is from a Wikipedia article, which is not bad in explaining what he did. I said he was known for the Foucault pendulum as well, to make sure that you understood how the Earth rotated and that sort of thing. So anyway, I just set up what I would normally do from an engineering standpoint. If I'm going to design something and I want to look at the data and see where it's going, I say, what's the known data? Well, the known data is the speed of light seems to be, since at least 1862, to be about a constant. So this 1.63 is basically 163 years, and I'm letting 100 years equal 1 foot. That's how you design this. So I have known data until 1862, and I have unknown data beyond 1862 in a backwards extrapolation to 13.8 billion years ago. Well, 13.8 billion years ago is a long time, and it's going to be a pretty big extrapolation, certainly off the whiteboard that I'm using here. So, turns out to be 138 million feet, or 26,136 miles. That's a long ways off my whiteboard. 24,901 miles is the circumference of the Earth. So it gives you a little bit of an idea how far that is. Also, does it take into account the fact that the Bible has many verses? Some say 17. I think I found a few more now, but I'm going to still use the one I used in the article I wrote for the Creation Club, which is David Reeves' ministry. Anyway, here's one. God stretched out the heavens, Job 9:8, stretching out the heavens like a tent, Psalm 104:2. God sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in, Isaiah 40:22. We can just go on down. There's more Isaiah verses, there's more Jeremiah verses, and finally there's a Zechariah verse. Thus declares the Lord who stretched out the heavens. Well, that's interesting that we now know that God stretches out the heavens, which is not really inconsistent with our, I guess, understanding of the Big Bang and inflation and some of the things that went on there. But anyway, my question is this: what was the speed of light when God stretched out the heavens? Was it infinite? And that is the question I've asked many people, including Hugh Ross. I asked him in person in 2004. I asked him on Twitter a while back, a long time ago, but I asked him in Twitter, and he said that this speed of light issue was answered in one of his books. Well, I had his book, and it's not answered in his book, and he just doesn't like to answer it because the answer he has to give is, I don't know. That's really the answer. We don't know what the variable was there in God stretching out the heavens. But if it was infinite, it certainly changes things. So, Christians, you need to get this. If you can change the speed of light in a laboratory, and you can, although we haven't really figured out how to go beyond the speed of light, that there's some interesting articles and stuff out there about doing it, but you can change the speed of light in the laboratory and you can slow it down. And you can apply this to geology too. If you can change the radioactive decay rates in a laboratory, and you can do that, then why can't God do that too? So that's my question. So I do have my Creation Club article on the speed of light under my name here, although you could simply just go on Google and type in Creation Club Steve Hendrickson, and you could probably find it that way too. It's a two-part article, so it's a little bit longer article and more involved than what I just gave. Okay, next. Refuting compromise. One of the things that Jonathan Sarfati did was he wrote a pretty good book. He's a friend of mine. He's a strong chess player, master level. I'm a master level chess player, so we get along good that way. He lives up in Akala, which is about 35 minutes or so from my house, so we see each other on occasion. But anyway, he went and did that and talked to him. So I think this is a very interesting question, but I have to tell you that these are huge, massive backwards extrapolations. There are assumptions that are being made, and we don't understand exactly what God means when he says he stretched out the heavens. And I'm okay with that. We don't necessarily have to know that. Also, I think it's interesting in Jason Lyle's book where he talks about the moon and the earth and how it's rotating around and when you look at this lunar recession, it turns out to be about 1.5 million years ago, and the Earth is supposed to be about 4.5 or 4.54 billions of years old. So if you go 1.5 billion years ago, you would have a real problem with the rate that the moon is receding from the Earth, including the fact that it just couldn't happen. It would disintegrate, it would mess the moon up. So I think there's some problems there. I think there's other areas you can look at too. So another interesting slide I wanted to throw in here. A common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect has monkeyed. So I'm thinking, and when he says that, monkeyed with something, he's sounding like an engineer. Monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The numbers one calculates from the facts seem to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion almost beyond question. I think that's a very good um, statement on his part, and he was a well-known mathematician. As a matter of fact, he coined the phrase
That
Big
that
Bang.
was Hoyle. You didn't say his name.
Yeah, that's Fred Hoyle.
Okay.
Yeah,
Is that
his name is in the lower part.
okay? There we go.
Okay. So let's just turn this argument over to the geology side. So radiometric dating of rock became a science in about the 1940s, but originally uh, Henri Becquerel went ahead and he was a French physicist and he discovered radioactivity and got the Nobel Prize in 1903 with Marie and Pierre Curie. And so 1896 was the discovery of radioactivity. And then they realized that, hey, you could use this to date rocks and that sort of thing. And so they had several methods of doing it. They had KAR, which is potassium argon, rubidium strontium, samarium neodymium, and lead are some of the typical ways of doing it. And so you want to do the same type of calculation? Well, if I go back to 1896, when they actually discovered it, I could go back to the 1940s, that'd make it a little smaller. But if I go back 129 years to 1896 from 2025, well, I would have 1.29 feet on my whiteboard. Okay, and then I'd have 1896 for Becquerel, and I would have the decay rate being a constant. And if it was 45 1,400,000 feet, which is 8598 miles. And just for a scale, 9,983 miles is the distance from New York City to Darwin, Australia. So that's your backward extrapolation, and we're dealing with a 4.5 billion years ago age of the Earth. when you're doing this. And so you're basically saying the decay rate has to be constant for the age of the Earth rocks. And so you're using the same type of idea, but we don't know that. It is simply an extrapolation of the known data that we have. Okay, some of the really good books that I have bought and used. As a matter of fact, the one on the right, Rethinking Radiometric Dating, I think by Dr. Cups, is a really good one to have. But the nice thing about the one that Dr. Don DeYoung did on the far left was in 2005, was after they did the rate project. And I'm going to talk about that for just a second. I think that was an important project for them to do and to look at some of the data that came out of it. And there's a very good book by John Reed on rocks aren't clocks as well. But the idea is these things have some concordant. Most people say, oh, these things line up, they're concordant. Well, they're not really concordant. There are many discordant dates between the methods on the same type of rock. And so this little chart that is on page 126 and 127 of this book, Thousands Not Billions, is in here, and you can't really see it too well, but I'm going to show it to you with a close-up of that section. But look at the bottom here, radioisotopes and the age of the Earth, RATE, they put the T in there, but that's the rate project data, and it was run from 1997 to 2005. I was fascinated by it, and I was really interested in their conclusions and what they got. And so here's a close-up of that sheet. And so we have the different methods for looking at the same rock and the same layers. And so the Cardenas basalt goes from 516, that's millions of years, 516 millions of years, up to Sumerio neodymium to 1588. That's like more than 1 billion years of discordance date on there. That's not good. The Bass Rapids Diabase Sill, also 841.5 million, and then they go all the way up to 15.84 there on the far right for lead. It's discordant. That's not correct. The Brahma amphibolite. I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I find it interesting. We have these differences. We go from 840 to 1883 on some of these tests that they did with the different dating methods. And there's a DVD that comes with that, let's see, there we go, Thousands Not Billions. There's a DVD that also comes with that. Okay, and so at the 14 to 17 minute point, it's explained by Dr. Steve Austin what those meant. And I've used that many times to teach in my apologetics class, just so people can see that some of these dating methods are not concordant, they're discordant, and that's a problem. And Vernon Cups and others note that problem. It is actual data, it's empirical data, and we're not looking at the data, we're seeing what the data is, and we're saying, look, this data doesn't really line up that well in many cases. So do we trust it? And by the way, we've checked the radiometric dates of certain rocks and stuff, and they've been way off, like some of the rocks at St. Helens and Mount St. Helens and places like that. Okay, so here's a recent 12 June 25, Alan Dunkley. He said, if geologists agree that igneous rocks contain only parent elements with no daughter elements, then measuring known age igneous rocks should show minimal to zero daughter elements in the samples. He talks about that. And these are some of the issues that people come up with as they're studying this method. I'm an electrical engineer, so I'm not exactly one of the people that gets into that much, but we do have some geological engineers that do, including John Reed and others. So also, here's a book written by Andy McIntosh. He is Wrist Friends. That's out there. He wrote Wonders of Creation with Dr. Stuart Burgess. They're both engineers in 2017. And here's what Andy wrote on page 185 of that book. He's talking about folded mountains. He said, often the layers are twisted and contorted, indicating that they have been bent while soft. Figures 2 and 3, and this we're looking at 3, are very striking examples of folding consistent with fast movement of water and twisting of soft sediments. And by the way, Andy's pretty good at doing this stuff because he's been working with air and other flows. And so he's more mechanically engineered minded in what he's doing. And he's looking at airflow in many cases about wings and things like that, but also water flow. So those types of things he does research on. And so when he researches something like this and puts it into a book, remember, when it's in a book, it's out there for everybody to criticize. So you're trying to be as accurate as you can possibly be with the known data that you're seeing. But that's a very impressive folded mountain right there in that picture. And there's more. There's the Mount St. Helens very rapid canyon building that occurred once it happened. And the eruption caused these fine layers within hours in many cases. Okay, here's a Dan Leith cartoon. He's got William Lane Craig, who is one of the old earthers. He says, I see parts of Genesis as true and other parts as myth. I call it mythohistory, that this makes it possible for the Bible and modern naturalistic science to fit together. The kids are looking at that and they say, my parents told me that mixing the truth with a lie, just makes a lie. And God wouldn't do that. And so we have the verse here in Numbers 23:19. God is not man that he should lie, or a son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said, and will he not do it? Or has he spoken, and will he not fulfill it? Numbers 23:19. So William Lane Craig is considered one of the great debaters on apologetics in the world. So I think that this was nicely done. And this is Jason Lyle's Biblical Science Institute ministry. All right, this is important. OECs, they're not hated by the world. Yes, they are hated and they're despised. Why do I say that? Because Richard Dawkins said it. He said, here's his Twitter post. In 14 May 2015, I said I'd never despise individuals, just their views. But there are limits, and young Earth creationists, y.e. creationists, who refuse to look at evidence past mine. Well, we don't exactly refuse to do that. But we're not surprised if the world hates us for that. Also, I always read this because I love it. So here we have the famous Oxford professor, and I've seen him at the University of Virginia when I taught there and stuff like that. You would see him strut around with everybody, and it was like, oh, he's almost a god as they're going around. But anyway, he's a very articulate guy. I will give him that. Here's what he says in this article, and I've given it, it's the Guardian. I've given the article at the bottom. But he says, I like mavericks. I like free spirits who buck the trend and strike out on their own. They are not usually right, but on the rare occasions when they are very right indeed. Importantly so, and all power to them. Maybe Burgess and McIntosh are right, and all the rest of us, biologists, geologists, archaeologists, historians, chemists, physicists, cosmologists, and yes, thermodynamicists, and respectable theologians, and the vast majority of the Nobel Prize winners, fellows of the Royal Society, and of the National Academies of the world, are wrong. Not just slightly wrong, but catastrophically, appallingly, devastatingly wrong. It is possible, and I am going to follow that possibility through to its logical conclusion. I shall not here defend the views held by the scientific establishment. I am among those who have done that elsewhere in many books. My purpose in this article is only to convey the full magnitude of the error into which, if Burgess and McIntosh are right, the scientific establishment has fallen. Wow. Anyway, note Dawkins spoke of the respectable theologians, meaning those who accept his billions of years timeline paradigm, and that would be like John Lennox and others that are like that. And it's also the timeline needed for neo-Darwinian and evolution to actually proceed. So that's an important one. Now, the last thing I'm going to talk about is Jesus Christ. Was he a young Earth creationist? Here's a little picture from 1965. Okay, in Dr. Terry Mortenson's book, it's a great book, Chapter 11, Jesus' View of the Age of the Earth. Look how many pages, 315 to 346. That's a lot of pages to make an argument that Jesus Christ is a young Earth creationist. It's very convincing. I love this book for that reason. If you don't have this book, I recommend you get it. You can buy it used, but it's a very good book. And he has another chapter on here. Chapter 12, he says apostolic witness to Genesis creation and the flood. That's 347 to 371. So that's a lot of pages too, to make a pretty strong argument that the New Testament is very much so telling us that Jesus Christ and the apostles were young earth creationists in their views. And by the way, I told you earlier, the argument for death and suffering makes sense much more so from a young earth creationist view. Okay, so here's some of the scriptures that are used in that book. John 10:35b, New King James, and the scripture cannot be broken. So yes, high view of scripture. John 17, and by the way, Old Testament scripture. John 17:17, sanctify them by your truth. Your word is truth. High view of the scriptures. Mark 10:6, this is one of the biggies. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. You know, I believe, Jesus, that he's talking about the beginning of the creation, day 6. He made them male and female. He gave Adam the right partner that he needed. Luke 11:50, New King James, Jesus called Abel. He goes through and talks about the prophets in the Old Testament. He called Abel the first prophet. Abel was killed by Cain. Okay, Mark 13:19 through 20, New King James. For in those days there will be tribulation, such has not been since, ready, the beginning of the creation, which God created until this time, nor shall ever be. Verse 20, and unless the Lord had shortened those days, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, whom he chose, he shortened the days. So these are some of the verses. I mean, there's a lot of verses and a lot of other argument provided by Terry Mortensen in his book. I recommend it highly. All right, here's the summary. I attended that homeschooling convention, very interesting, had a lot of fun talking to people and answering some questions, and really some of the people really appreciated it. So that was fun. Question of suffering and death in the world has a very good young earth creation answer, does not have a good old earth creation answer, which has to be something new under the sun, in my opinion. High science. The theory of evolution is what is high science. It's the only one to be taught, but theory of evolution has got some problems and it's questionable. Also, science doesn't prove things. It's just consistent with the observations. That's part of the scientific method. Scopes trial, 1925 plus Inherit the Wind, was propaganda. In many cases, it was set up by the ACLU, the trial was, and then Inherit the Wind just basically wanted to bury conservative Christianity. Astronomy, we have super big assumptions. The constant speed of light is a massive assumption. There's no question about it in my mind. We are basically saying it has to be extrapolated backwards to 13.8 billion years as a primary constant that never changes. And we don't know that, especially based on some of the Bible verses. Geology, radiometric dating method. Also, constant decay rates, the same issue as the assumptions from astronomy. These are pretty massive assumptions. By the way, just for your knowledge, engineers don't like to go more than about 10% beyond the data. So this is way over that for an engineer when they're looking at this. Richard Dawkins despises yeks. Well, if the world hated you, no, it hated me first. Well, I can see that. Was Jesus Christ a yek? Yes, and the apostles too. I think that's pretty clear from Mortensen's book. And that, my friends, I will close with one last thing. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the seas in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. I believe it was a 7-day creation, and that's consistent.
6 day.
And that's the end.
Thank you very much, Steve. That was really good. I definitely held my interest. We don't have
Well, I had to talk pretty fast.
it. Yeah, you were moving along, and I appreciate that. I did give you that strict timeline, so thank you for following that.
So
Can
do
you?
I need to stop sharing?
Oh, wait, no, no. I want you to go back to that Cardenas basalt slide.
Oh, okay.
If you can quickly find it. If you can't, that's fine too.
No, it's no problem right here.
Okay. So I just need a little more information on this.
Well, okay, I'll try to answer it. What's your information?
Um, so it is showing how are they using this to prove old ages, long ages?
Okay. Well, what they're doing is they're showing discordant dates. In other words, they're saying when they dated the Cardenas basalt,
Mm.
they used potassium argon and they got about 516 um, million years there.
Okay, so this is
And
just
rubidium,
based.
strontium, those
Okay,
different dates gave big different dates. For example, 516 all the way up to 1588 for the Sumerian neodymium one. So that's more than 1 billion years of discordance,
yeah,
and that's a problem. You're supposed to
okay.
have these dates. You're supposed to be able to use these dates, and they're supposed to be concordant. So um, you should be able to see similar dates, something close to them. Those aren't similar.
I think I misunderstood you. I thought you said they were concordant. And
No, no, they're
no, you said
discordant.
discordant. Okay.
Major discordance. Yes.
Okay, so then that my next question is, I've been wanting to ask people this, and I should probably ask a geologist, and we do have our geologist Jeff on, but I will ask you, Steve. Um, so did Mount St. Helen really create new rock, or was the rock spewed up from inside the earth?
Yeah, it was basically new lava flows, and so um it became rock. It started out molten, that spread out,
Okay, so the lava came out of the earth,
and
flowed, and then it hardened into basalt, and then they carbon date the basalt that
I
came out
think
of there.
I think they took some stuff out of the dome and stuff that had hardened, and I'm not exactly sure of that. Actually, if you buy the Rate Projects books, they're pretty expensive, so I don't have them. So I was pretty much dependent upon what was reported by Don DeYoung in his book Billions, um, thousands and billions, or thousands, not billions, is what his book is.
Okay.
So I was dependent more on that, giving a summary of what the Rate Project did.
And then I just wanted to make a comment on Richard Dawkins. I thought he was dead.
Nope.
He's, oh, he's not. Okay. All right
No,
then.
I think he's had some health issues.
Okay. I must be
But
thinking of somebody else.
Andy has, as far as I know, met him.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering because he's talking about Andy, and so I thought he had passed away. And
No,
we
he hasn't passed away yet that I have heard.
okay. Well, I'm not asking him to do that. I'm just was wondering.
Well, I would hope he'd know the Lord before he does it.
Yes. Um, okay, now you can stop sharing your screen.
Okay.
I don't have, let's see, Jeff made a comment, speed of light changes with refractive index of materials. Speed of light also changes in relation to gravitational force. Note, anytime we measure the speed of light, we are doing so in a gravity well. Did that make any sense?
Okay. Well, I'm not really much of a measurement person. I'm just one of those guys who looks at when I'm looking at the data, I'm trying to see what data is actually showing us what the speeds are, and are those data. If you're going to say it's a constant, then you would want the data to be the same amount, around uh, 300,000 kilometers per second or 300 million meters per second. You
And
would want
then
it to be constant with that.
Jeff also is asking if he could get a copy of your slides
Oh,
because there's a lot of information and it went by
there
really fast.
there is a lot of information, and that's why I'm glad this is being taped. But I do make copies of my slides and send them to my class. So then that's one way of doing it.
Okay. All right, then if you have any parting comments, I'm gonna let everybody know we're Creation Fellowship Santee. We meet every other Thursday or 2 Thursdays a month. If you're interested, you can find us on Facebook for Creation Fellowship Santee. We also have some video platforms. We have YouTube where we're Creation Fellowship Santee. We also have Rumble. We are CFS 2020 on Rumble. On BitChute, we are Creation Fellowship Santee, and we have a new podcast, and we're CFS virtually there on Apple Podcasts. So if you go to Apple Podcast and type in CFS virtually there, you'll find us. And I've been uploading our recordings. Now I haven't uploaded all 100 of them because it's a bit time consuming. So if you want to learn more about our speakers, you can go to the podcast or any of our videos. And with that, I am going to shut off the live stream. I need to get there.
Okay.